Hi, good afternoon. My name is Nicole Fresard. I'm a senior project manager with the Sacramento District of the Corps of Engineers. I work for the Bountiful, Utah Regulatory Office, and I have been with the Corps of Engineers. I started with the Jacksonville District in the Miami office, and I've been working with the Corps for about 5 years. And actually been doing regulatory work for a very long time since I graduated from college. I'm going to be talking about the Corps' regulatory program, specifically about the Programmatic General Permit number 10. But I'll give you an introduction into the regulatory review, what waters of the United States are, the activities that require permits under Section 4 of the Clean Water Act, and I'll go over what Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is. We'll talk about the Corps of Engineers permitting process, and then we'll go over a quick overview of other types of permits that the Corps of Engineers reviews and issues. What's the permit authority that the Corps of Engineers has? Our permitting authority comes from Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So Section 10 of the Clean Water Act mainly deals with tidal waters. So here in Utah, though, that doesn't really apply much, but there's a lot of Section 10 waters that we deal with in other parts of the country, like California, Florida, the Great Lakes. So we are not really going to talk much about Section 10 waters today, but we do deal with a lot of Section 404 waters here in Utah. And what does that mean? It just basically means that under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, a permit is required from the Corps of Engineers for the discharge of fill material in waters of the United States, and that includes wetlands. What is fill material? So fill material is anything that you would put in the water, including sediment, rocks, concrete, anything like that, would require review from us. So when it comes to waters of the United States, waters. So we recently had a rule change, and the rule changed last month on June 22nd, and now the new rule is the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And under the new waters rule, we have 4 types of waters, and that includes territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, tributaries, lakes and ponds, and impoundment of jurisdictional waters, and adjacent wetlands. So anytime that there's a discharge of fill material in any of those types of waters, a review and approval from the Corps of Engineers would be required. What kinds of work do we review? So it would be anything from little projects like, I don't know, bank stabilization projects along rivers and streams in people's backyards, to huge mining projects or I don't know, railroad installation projects, development projects, including construction of residential developments and things like that. So we basically see all sorts of things, from little things to huge infrastructure projects. So our days go from, sometimes I get to the office and I get an application for something really tiny, and then at the end of the day, I can be in a meeting for a huge environmental impact statement type project. So it's always very interesting to work for the Corps of Engineers. So when it comes to the Corps permitting process, right now we're going to focus mainly on the Programmatic General Permit number 10. And this came up from an application from the Wild Utah project that came in for temporary sediment catchments. And it was a restoration project. So Janice from Wild Utah project came over, and she wanted to submit an application, and we started talking about the requirements of the Corps permitting process. So she had the great idea of coming up with this outreach program so we could explain what it is that we actually need to move these applications quickly. Because for us, this is very simple. We do this every single day, and actually the general permit number 10 is one of the easiest, fastest permits that we process. But there's a lot of technical information that may not be the easiest thing to process for normal people that wouldn't normally see and have to deal with these kinds of things on a regular basis. So what is a general permit? A general permit is something that is issued, a permit that is issued every 5 years. So typically, when you come to the Corps of Engineers for a general permit, you don't come for a permit, you come for a permit verification. So we wouldn't necessarily issue a permit to every person. We would issue a verification that the work that you're applying for complies with the permits and complies with the conditions of the permit. So that's why this is normally a faster process than any other permit that we would review in our office. So it is very important that when somebody comes to the office to get a verification under the general permit number 10, you actually go and read the permit, because there's a bunch of conditions that you should be aware of. You're basically signing a contract between the applicant or you and the federal government saying, hey, I agree to all these things that are specified in the general permit number 10. So if you're interested in getting this permit, you should always go to our webpage, get the permit, and read it from top to bottom, and make sure that you understand every single one of the, all the information that's in the permit and understand the conditions. So what is the applicability of the general permit number 10? It applies to perennial and intermittent streams, and it covers activities that are that have minimal environmental impacts, and this covers cumulative and individual. So anything that is very small and that has very small environmental impacts would be something that would be covered or that could be covered under the general permit number 10. And these are things like road crossings, culvert installation, bridges. Sometimes we would evaluate things like little residential developments and things like that that would have really small environmental impacts. And then some restoration projects would also qualify for the general permit number 10. There's some exclusions in the general permit number 10. And one of the things that the main things that I think is important to point out is that special aquatic sites are excluded from authorization in this permit. One of the special aquatic sites would be wetlands. So in projects, restoration projects like the temporary sediment catchment projects, if there are wetlands along the banks of a stream, for example, those projects, if you're planning on putting this discharging fill material along those wetland areas, those projects would be excluded from the general permit number 10. And we would have to review those impacts or those projects separately under a different type of core authorization. So it is very important that when you're planning your project, that you look at the site conditions, and if there is if there's an impact to wetlands, that you consider that, and that you notice that, hey, this is not going to qualify for a GP10. I need to go directly to the Corps and apply for a different level permit. Other activities that are not that will not qualify for a GP10 would be relocation of streams, including channelization of natural channels, and then activities that are occurring on tribal lands, or activities that would impact endangered and threatened species or cultural resources. And then activities that are emergency situations would also be excluded from the PGP-10 permit. However, we do have a different type of general permit that deals with emergency situations, and that is general permit number 8. And that one actually we can process faster than the PGP-10. So if there's a danger to property or life, you can definitely come to the court directly, and we'll provide information on what it is that you need to give us so we can review that type of authorization. And it's also a general permit that's already been issued. We just need to make sure that it complies with the permit conditions, and then we'll go from there. But then again, emergency authorizations are not included in the PGP-10. So the limitations of the general permit number 10, one of the things that's very important to note is that the project needs to be a single and complete project. And I'll get into that a little bit later on in the presentation, and I'll have some examples of what that means. But for perennial and intermittent streams, the activity or the impacts need to be limited to 300 linear feet and to 500 linear feet if there's bioengineering incorporated in the project. However, for restoration projects, there's no limit in the length of stream that is impacted by the project. And then again, the project cannot adversely impact listed species or cultural resources. And when we're talking about listed species, we're talking about federally listed species, not state listed species. So that's an important distinction to make when it comes to threatened and endangered species. Another thing to point out is that the general permit number 10 cannot be modified. And I believe that the state of Utah can modify their authorization. We cannot do that. So for example, if you go through the process and you get a verification for a PGP-10 for, let's say, 200 linear feet of impacts, and then you realize that your project will impact 250 linear feet of impacts. And then you come back and say, well, I need a modification for the additional 50 linear feet. We would have to go through the process again. We don't have the capability of modifying a verified permit. But since you already have most of the information for the original permit, then it shouldn't be that complicated to get the second verification. But then again, we would have to go through the process again, unfortunately. Another thing that is important here is that unauthorized activities are not included in the PGP-10. So if the work has already been done, you need to come to the court directly so we can process the after the fact work, if it's something that we can permit after the fact, or if we need to go through a restoration or something like that, we can review it, but that's something that we need to do directly, and it cannot be done through the stream alteration group. So when it comes to the PGP resources, where can you get the documents? So you can definitely go to our webpage, the Sacramento District. We have a great webpage where we can have all sorts of resources. So we have information for our PGP-10, and we have information for all our other types of permits, in addition to mitigation information and a bunch of other really cool and interesting things. But one thing to remember is that the application process is done through the state. So we don't normally, well, we don't ever get the application submitted to us directly. So the joint permit application goes directly to the Division of Water Rights, and then the Division of Water Rights will submit the information to us. I'm the project manager for Salt Lake County, Weber County, and Davis County. So if the project is in that area, I would get the application. And then if the project is anywhere else in the state, it would go to whoever the project manager is for that area. Okay, so When it comes to our review process, the Division of Water Rights gets the application, and then they send it to us, and there's usually 3 outcomes. One, they give us the application, and then we review it. The application is complete, and then we make a determination that we can verify the general permit, and we say, hey, state, go ahead, issue the general permit on our behalf. The second outcome would be this project does not qualify for the permanent conditions, so we need to review it, and you need to tell the applicant to come to us directly, and then we'll work with them and see what we can do. And then the third would be, hey, we don't have enough information to move forward with the process, which is something that happens very often, and I would say this happens, I don't know, maybe 60–70% of the times. So we do request additional information from the applicant so we can make a determination whether we can or approve the verification of the general permit number 10. But when you have a project that you know that you will need some sort of authorization from the Corp of Engineers, just make sure that you get the Corps involved early in the process. Don't wait until you have the contractor in your backyard ready to get started. And I've had that multiple times when I've had applicants call me and tell me, my contractor is waiting, I need to get my permit tomorrow. And that is not something that we can do because we need to go through our evaluation process. So just make sure that, we can't give you a permit in one day or in a week. The process will take longer than that, especially if we need to go back and forth getting information from you. So just keep that in mind. We're not here to delay the process. We just need to get enough information so we can move forward with a permit decision. And one other thing to keep in mind is that you need to avoid impacts to resources. Sometimes just because you want to get something doesn't necessarily mean that you will get it. You need to go through the avoidance and minimization process. So just because you can put whatever amount of rock you want in the back of your house on a stream for bank stabilization doesn't necessarily mean that you will get that. So just think about minimizing impacts to resources. So that's one of the really important things that we try to explain to applicants. When it comes to the joint application form, for us, it's really important that you understand that we need to get a complete application in order to process the verification. So our application form does not include one very important piece of information, which is an email address. I don't know if this form is really old or what happened when we came up with the form, but we don't have a space for an email address. If you give me an email address, this is definitely going to speed up the process. So make sure that you include applicant contact information. Project location is really important. Project description, be very specific, and just make sure that you describe the project in relation to impacts to waters. We get a lot of descriptions based on I want to make my backyard nice or things like that. That's great because I want to make my backyard nice too. But what we regulate is the discharge in waters of the United States. So that's the information that we need to get. So let us know what the actual work that relates to our regulatory review is. Project purpose, let us know what the intent of the work is. Sometimes we get applications that have blank spaces all over. We're asking for that information for a reason. I need to justify your project in order to approve it. So please make sure that you're being thorough and provide the information that we're asking. So when we're asking whether a project is a single and complete project, what we're asking is whether the project has something called independent utility. And I know that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but what that basically means is, can the project be done without other components? And there's a really good example of a temporary sediment catchment project that was provided by the Wild Utah project. And here we have 3 segments, or four or 5 segments actually. So we have temporary segments, temporary sediment catchments in one area of the stream, in another area of the stream, and then here towards the end. So yesterday, when the Division of Water Rights was talking about their permitting process, they were saying, well, we issue 1 permit for the entire stream in a case like this. For us, we would look at this a little bit different, because if you look at the top of the screen right here by the number 20, can you do this section of the project without doing the other sections on the bottom part? If the answer is yes, then the project has independent utility and you would be able to separate those sections of work. So maybe for this project, we wouldn't make you separate the application. And when we process it, we would return this and give you 3 project numbers. And instead of asking you for 3 applications, we would just ask for 1 and tell you, hey, well, we're processing this under SPK 2021, 2, and 3. However, this would make a difference if you're, for example, processing a culvert in a property that is 200 linear feet, and you decide that you're going to do 100 linear feet this year, and then you're going to do 100 linear feet next year. So you're separating 1 project that should be 1 into 2, but you're going to give us 2 applications. That project is 1 project that has no independent utility. So that is not a single and complete, that is a single and complete project. So you can't separate it into 2. So that's what basically a single complete project is. So when we're asking, does this project is this a project single and complete? Just make sure that you are answering that question, because if you don't answer, then we are going to be returning that application. Because independent utility and single and complete, that's something that's really important to us, because we need to make sure that we're processing, a project the way that we should be processing it, instead of processing multiple applications for 1 property. Another thing that we see a lot with the joint permit applications is this one section in page 1 of the application that is left blank. If the project includes the discharge of dredge or fill material into a water course or wetland, what is the cubic yards of material, the acreage of waters of the United States affected by the project, the source and type of material, and the length of stream that will be impacted below the ordinary high water mark. If you're coming for a permit from the Corps, is because you are discharging fill material in the water, in waters of the United States. So don't leave this blank, because we will send you a request for additional information. Especially, let us know what the length of stream that will be impacted, because that will determine whether we can give you a GB10 or, if you need to come to the Corps directly, because there's that 300 linear feet threshold for the different types of permits. So that is really important. Don't leave it blank. Please fill that out. And then there's other sections in the application where you should include alternatives considered. So what we're looking at is, hey, did you look at other things that you could have done instead of the project that you're proposing? Propose mitigation. Usually for small projects, if there's something that actually requires mitigation, it's not something that we would likely be able to approve under general permit number 10. However, if you are, for example, disturbing riparian vegetation, just make sure that you're putting information on how you're planning on restoring those impacts. Another way of mitigating impacts would be including best management practices during construction activities. So That's the kind of information we need to know. Are you putting, silt fences or something to prevent erosion and sedimentation during construction activities? Don't just leave it blank. It's really important that we have that information because, like I said before, I need to make sure that your project is not going to create environmental impacts in the short and long term. Cultural resources information, government authorizations, and the project schedule is also important to include. So along with the application form, you should include a location map that clearly shows where you're doing the work, and a site plan and cross-sectional views that show the ordinary high water mark. And showing the ordinary high water mark is one of the really important things to show on the plans, because the ordinary high water mark is what determines the Corps' jurisdiction. Anything above the ordinary high water mark is not jurisdictional for the Corps. Anything below is jurisdictional. So here in this slide, you can basically see the Corps of Engineers regulatory jurisdiction. And this is a nice sketch that includes everything, including tidal waters and fresh waters. So when I mentioned before Section 10 and Section 404 waters, it shows you where the limits of our jurisdiction are. But like I said, we focus here on Section 404 waters. So there's a really long definition of what the ordinary high water mark is. But the easy way of knowing what that is basically looking for staining on or rack lines on the banks, changes in channel slope, destruction or absence of vegetation, or drift debris. So when you're seeing that change along the banks, that's where your ordinary high water mark is. So for these kinds of projects, we're not going to ask you to get like a surveyor or something, or like, elevations and all that, but we do need to know where the ordinary high water mark is. And then we need to get ground photos of the site. And the reason for that is because we need to make sure that there's no wetlands along the stream where you're doing the work. Because again, we need to make sure that you're not impacting special aquatic sites. And then if you're impacting riparian vegetation, just make sure that you include a restoration plan. And for bank stabilization projects, include information about what you're doing when it comes to the bank stabilization. So I wanted to include a checklist of the most common issues that we find with the applications. Ground photos, we get a lot of pictures with snow cover photos. If you send me something like that, we're going to return them because we can't see what vegetation is under the snow. The application doesn't include the area or volume of fill below the ordinary high water mark. The plans don't have cross sections, or the plans don't show the ordinary high water mark. Again, if we don't have that information, we can determine our jurisdiction. And then we don't get information for dewatering or best management practices. So again, that's really important so we can see how you're doing the work, because if you're putting a culvert or you're doing a restoration project or something, if there's water running, how are you putting that fill in that stream with water? At least give us an explanation of how you're planning on doing that. So when we get the application, and the application is complete, and I'm going to try to rush a little because I know we're running out of time. We have 20 days to make a determination, but that's when we have a complete application. So everything that we need to make a permit decision. So once we have that, we send an email to the state saying, hey, go ahead, issue a permit, verify the permit on our behalf, we're good to go. If we can't do that, then we'll tell the state, issue a permit, a state permit only, and then we'll move forward with our review and either issue a nationwide permit or another level permit. Or then if we still need more information, then we'll continue going back and forth with the applicant to complete whatever it is that we need. But we try to do all that within 20 days, from when we get the information. And then I'll go over the permit conditions very quickly. Again, make sure that if you're interested in getting the PGP-10, read the conditions. Basically here, you're letting us enter your property. You're saying that you're not going to destroy riparian vegetation, that you're not going to do a bunch of things, that you're going to comply with your 401 certification. You're going to, if you're putting a culvert, you're going to comply with culvert requirements. So it is important that you read all that. So what happens if you can't get your PGP-10 because your work doesn't qualify? Then you would need to go through a different type of permit. And then we have nationwide permits, which are project specific, and those take a little bit longer, between 45 and 60 days. And depending on the work, we have nationwide 13s for bank stabilization, nationwide 14s for linear transportation projects, and things like that. And those are limited to half an acre of impacts and 300 linear feet of stream impacts. And then if we can't authorize your project under that, we would have to go through an individual permit, which takes a little bit longer because the review is, it's a more in-depth review, usually take 120 days from a complete application. And those require a full public interest review, Section 404B1 guidelines. And that means that we have to go through a full NEPA review, which means National Environmental Policy Act. You need an individual 401 certification, and then you need to comply with every single environmental and policy act that you can imagine that we need to include in our review, including Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. I will be emailing this information so everybody can have it. This is the contact information for all the project managers in the state. We do have one new person in the office, so this needs to be updated at some point, but she doesn't really have any areas at this point. So this should be the most up-to-date contact list. So are there any questions? And I apologize for going over, well, we're still on time. So are there any questions that I can answer?
Yes, thank you so much, Nicole. Okay, so the first question we have has kind of two main parts, so I'll ask it in two parts. When an entity comes to the Corps with an application, what triggers an environmental impact statement? Can review by the Corps trigger an environmental impact statement if there is evidence that the project will result in an environmental impact?
Well, the environmental impact statement review deals mostly with larger scale projects. So when we're doing, and since we're talking about general permit number 10s, again, those are very minor projects. When we look at environmental impact statements, for example, there's one that I'm doing right now for a new railroad. So these are, major impacts, acres and acres and acres of impact. So again, it's something huge that we would be reviewing. So it wouldn't necessarily be something that we would say, hey, we want this to be reviewed under an environmental impact statement. There's a lot of factors that would determine that, and it wouldn't necessarily just be the Corps. There are a lot of other federal agencies that get involved into that process. So for example, it depends on where the project is located. So if it's in forest land, the Forest Service would be involved. If BLM is somehow related, they could be the lead federal agency dealing with the environmental impact statement. So we could be the lead, or we could be cooperating in the environmental impact statement. So there's a lot of ins and outs when it comes to those types of projects.
Okay. And the second part of that question is, can agencies and the public comment on a proposal trigger of an EIS?
Well, so when it comes to larger scale projects, the process would be putting that project on public notice first. So the public would be allowed to provide comments. I'm not sure if we would be able to elevate it to a level where it would go to an environmental impact statement. But there is some kind of mechanism that you can go from a public notice to a public hearing. So there is a mechanism, but I'm not sure if we can go from a public notice to an environmental impact statement. So that's something that I would definitely have to check, because like I said, there's a difference between the impacts and then the type of public involvement for each type of project. But yeah, I can definitely check on that, and whoever had that question, you can give them my contact information and we can talk about that, you know, later on.
Good. And then we have another question from Kate. She says, some people might have different ideas of what a wetland or spring or other water body is. What reference should an applicant use to determine what type of water body they're dealing with?
Okay, so that's a really good question, because when it comes to wetlands, so when it comes to wetlands, for the Corps of Engineers, you need to have 3 parameters. You need to have hydrology, soils, and vegetation. Usually, the applicant would come back and give us a aquatic resources report, and we would have to verify that information. So yeah, it is sometimes a little subjective, but the Corps is the one that has the final say on what a wetland is. So when there's a doubt, the applicant can always come to the Corps and provide an aquatic resources report, and we can go and verify it and say, yeah, we agree with you that this is not a wetland, or no, we don't agree and this is a wetland. So when there's a doubt, we can make a jurisdictional determination on that area.
Perfect, thank you. And then Paul says, how does the Corps deal with permitting of flood control projects, such as projects through the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, for debris and sediment removal from a river channel using heavy equipment? It seems that some flood control entities are skirting around Corps requirements by indicating that they are removing material but not filling. But bed sediment removal necessarily disturbs the bed of a channel. Wouldn't bed disturbance be considered as fill?
Okay, so we do have some nationwide permits that deal with flood control, and I'm actually processing some applications for that. But yeah, there's a distinction between dredging or excavating and placement of fill material. So when we're talking about, there's a distinction too when it comes to the location where you're doing it. Because if you're doing it in a stream, it's different if you're doing it in a stream and if you're doing it in a wetland. Because if you're changing the elevation in a wetland area, you're impacting the function of the wetland. So you are creating an impact in the wetland. So we would evaluate those things on a case by case. So yeah, just because it's a flood control project doesn't necessarily mean that it's exempt from every type of authorization. And there's a reason why we have specific permits that deal with that, with those kinds of work. So yeah, they're not automatically exempt from, Corps review. Yeah, no, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Jackie. So she wonders if you can please address how you approach BDAs for review.
Well, personally, I just started reviewing them, but my office has been dealing with them for a while, and we're reviewing them under restoration projects. So if there is a wetland impact, we would have to elevate the review to a nationwide type permit. Otherwise, we would review it under general permit number 10, and that's why we were doing this presentation. Because we wanted to show people how to fill out the applications and all that to make the process more, faster and expedite the review process and all that on our end. But yeah, it would definitely be treated as a restoration project, whether it's a PGP 10 or a nationwide permit. The only difference would be whether there's impacts to wetlands or no impacts to wetlands.
Perfect. And we have another BDA related question. So Allison says, when it comes to filling out the section with the cubic yards of fill that could be discharged, do you have any tips with calculating that specifically for BDAs?
That is a good question. I'm not 100% sure. I think maybe Janice would be a better resource when it comes to that. Just because I haven't really been in the field and actually seen how these things are built. I would just say just use the formula for volume. But like I said, I haven't been in the field, so I think Janice would definitely be a best resource a better resource when it comes to that information.
Okay. All right, and then we have one last question from Tony, who says, I am the Colorado Green River Sovereign Lands Coordinator for Utah DNR. Annually, after spring runoff, our boat ramps are filled in with native, naturally deposited silt clays. Is a joint stream bank alt permit required to clear the silt clays off of the ramps? Every year, the resulting cut banks render the ramps unusable.
I would say always contact the Corps and send pictures just to make sure that you're not running into a situation that you may need a permit to do something. I mean, that sounds like something that you wouldn't need a permit for. But I always recommend send an email, call whoever's in charge of that county, just to be on the safe side. We're always here to help, so and we're always available. So just give us a call, send us a picture, and just make sure that whatever it is that you're doing does not require a permit, to be on the safe side.
Wonderful. Okay, that looks like all the questions we've got, and we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, Nicole, and everyone on this call. We really appreciate all of this information.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Hopefully we'll see you again soon, and we hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Awesome. Bye. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.